Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to this week's show. We're going to be taking a look at the astrology of the week starting November 23rd. Now, in fact, there aren't a lot of astrology aspects or events happening this last week of November. I am going to talk about one of the aspects that is happening, though, and that is Mercury Retrograde. So just to get the dates and details up straight away, Mercury will be retrograde or moving backwards in Sagittarius. So Mercury's retrograde is in the sign of Sagittarius. That starts on Monday, November 25th, and it will run all the way through until Sunday, December 15. So we have about a 3-week Mercury retrograde cycle this time round. While it is moving in reverse, Mercury will move backwards from 22 degrees of Sagittarius all the way back to 6 degrees of Sagittarius. I know there is a lot that gets said about Mercury retrograde, and so today I want to clear up a few things, maybe put things into perspective, and then also share a few tips about working with Mercury retrograde. Before I do, I want to let you know that my relationship astrology course has just started and there is still time to sign up. You can find out more or register via my website, kellysastrology.com. This is an intermediate level 4-part online training. It includes video classes, extra reading, as well as homework activities that you do get personal feedback on. Plus, it includes live Q&As with me. If you'd like to know more, pop over to kellysastrology.com. All right, let's get into this Mercury retrograde. First off, it's going to be good to understand that Mercury will go retrograde into this backwards or reverse cycle between 3 and 4 times a year. So we're all living through various Mercury retrograde cycles throughout any given year. This isn't a new thing, and it's a thing that happens fairly frequently. In fact, every 3 months or so, Mercury takes one of these backwards or retrogrades spins through the sky. So first things first, no, you do not need to put your whole life on hold just because Mercury is going retrograde. Yes, Mercury is a planet that's associated with communication, technology, business and trade, travel and logistics. And so yes, Mercury does govern or is associated with many aspects of modern life. But I want to go a little bit beyond this sort of superficial understanding of Mercury retrograde. So first up, what we're doing when we focus on Mercury retrograde is we're identifying a factor associated with Mercury's condition, and we might be giving it more weight than it deserves, at least on its own. So when we're thinking about how well a planet is functioning or how effective a planet might be and how smoothly the things that it represents might be operating, we're looking at the condition of that planet. And there are a number of factors that we look at to assess or determine the function and effectiveness of a planet. Moving backwards or being retrograde is one of those factors that speaks to a planet's condition. But there are other factors like sign-based dignity or debility. For instance, is the planet in rulership or detriment or exaltation and fall? Is it in triplicity, etc.? Another factor that's important is a planet's aspects to the other planets in the zodiac, in the sky. And that's just kind of 3 of the core factors that affect a planet's condition. But there are other nuances as well. The planet's relationship to the sun. Is it visible, not visible, for instance? And so, yes, for sure, communication matters, transport matters, business matters, might be a little bit wonky when Mercury is retrograde, but those kinds of things can also be wonky when Mercury isn't retrograde, but when Mercury is in a tricky aspect, like a square to Neptune, for instance, or even when Mercury isn't retrograde, but might be moving through a sign that offers Mercury limited support, like when Mercury is in the sign of its detriment or its fall. On the other hand, Mercury could be retrograde, but that may be happening while Mercury is in one of its favorite signs. Maybe Mercury is in Gemini or Virgo, where Mercury has rulership power, but it may be retrograde there. And that retrograde may be less troublesome because Mercury has a lot of support from the sign that it's in. So for some weird reason, Mercury retrograde has just really captured the attention of many, many people in astrology and learning about astrology. And it's for sure something to be aware of, but it's kind of missing a few things when we just focus in on the Mercury retrograde piece. Another piece to consider in terms of how much will any given Mercury retrograde affect you personally is that each of us via our unique charts is more or less influenced by Mercury in general based on our natal chart. So there are some charts that are really strong Mercury birth charts. And if that's you, then yes, it would make sense to watch Mercury retrogrades more closely. This might be you if you have a Gemini or a Virgo ascendant, for instance, which elevates Mercury in your chart as the planet that represents you and has this helmsman power in your chart as a whole. So if you have a Gemini or Virgo rising, then paying attention to Mercury retrogrades might make specific sense for you. If you have a lot of planets in the signs of Gemini or Virgo. Maybe you're not a Gemini or Virgo rising, but you have a stellium or you have a bunch of planets in either Gemini or Virgo. Then it would make sense to pay attention to Mercury, since many planets, many parts of your chart and life are ultimately influenced by what's going on with Mercury. If you don't fulfill either of those criteria, then Mercury retrograde is probably not going to be the most important thing to be watching. Just keep that part in mind. And then separate to your natal chart, which kind of gives us ongoing things to be aware of, there may be times like timing cycles or predictive cycles when Mercury may be more important for you for a set period of time. Mercury might be activated as something called your Time Lord planet. Maybe you're in a profection year that is Gemini or Virgo, and thus your kind of timing cycles are really influenced by Mercury for a particular year of your life. In that case, for those particular periods or years in your life, you would definitely want to watch Mercury retrograde more closely. But even with that, watching Mercury retrograde shouldn't mean putting your whole life on pause. Instead, a more constructive, a kind of maybe productive way of working with Mercury retrograde is to think about what part of my chart, which house in my chart is hosting Mercury retrograde. And then you could think about, where could I be really consciously choosing to review, rethink, reorganize, or explore different options around the topics of the house in my chart where Mercury is actually retrograde? And that means one of the 12 houses is going to maybe have a strong connection to a Mercury retrograde, which won't be your whole life. So maybe you can use the Mercury retrograde to rethink or review specific areas of your life. Maybe see Mercury retrograde as a bit of a cosmic invitation to reflect, to pause, to reassess. So another point to keep in mind here is that a Mercury retrograde, it's not a fatal or terminal kind of astro event. It certainly can be slightly annoying. I know even in our home, we spent, a really long time on the phone with one of our heating companies this morning because we closed an account with them months ago, but they're still charging us. And we had to take our time to clarify their error so we can get a refund for the overpayment. Sure, that's annoying, but it doesn't derail our whole lives. It takes up a bit of time, might make us late for something else, but we can manage it. And that's often what Mercury retrograde, whether it's a blooper or a mix-up might be, is it's kind of annoying, it's distracting, it can take up time to sort out a little bit of a mess, but it's very manageable to do so. Trust me, there are other kinds of astro timing events that are much more kind of firm and barrier out in their nature. There's sort of more of a no, you cannot go here. Mercury retrograde is not like that. Mercury retrograde is not that type of barrier blockage astro event. So I'm hoping that you're beginning to understand that many parts of your life can and will continue in a somewhat regular manner, even with Mercury retrograde. I'm thinking about, for me, myself, there is, a regular fitness session that I go to every week. And back around the eclipses, that regular routine was really disrupted because sometimes we forget that eclipses are incredibly disrupting, much more so than Mercury retrograde. But for this Mercury retrograde, that particular fitness appointment each week is going on like clockwork. So there are other things that can be more disruptive to our lives than Mercury retrograde. What I'm really trying to do here is put Mercury retrograde into context and also give you some ways of working with it. So hopefully that's coming through so far. So for all of us, Mercury retrograde, it is the planet of thinking going backwards. So it is a useful cycle for rethinking and reassessing, for questioning our thoughts and our ideas, maybe for questioning how we've acted or what we've said and whether we want to revisit or repeat things and maybe do them slightly differently. A do-over is not usually a bad thing. It could be a second chance to make an improvement or to refine things so that we better express what we're really trying to say as we go. Now, this particular Mercury retrograde has some extra factors inhibiting Mercury's function in addition to the retrograde. And so with all of that said, this is one of those Mercury retrograde cycles that has a few different things going on. And so we may get some of those classic Mercury bloopers, not just because of the retrograde, but because it's the retrograde plus these other factors. So Mercury in Sagittarius, this is Mercury in one of the signs of its detriment. So Mercury is already a little bit, wobbly on the details here. Mercury in Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. Jupiter itself is in Gemini, which is its detriment sign. So we have this kind of double down on kind of wobbly energy, big ideas that aren't really backed up by substance. Mercury in Sagittarius is also making a square to Saturn, sign-based square to Saturn, and some degree-based squares to Saturn. And that is very restraining. It's restraining for any planet, but it's particularly restraining for a planet that is in the sign of its detriment. So Saturn might be coming in really strong to Mercury in Sagittarius. And all of that is going on even before Mercury gets retrograde. So this particular Mercury retrograde is just one extra factor for Mercury, the retrograde, that is compounding a number of other factors that already make Mercury a little hazy, a little forgetful, a little overconfident, a little too enthusiastic. Mercury in Sagittarius may not be able to follow through on the big ideas or the grand plans that it is conjuring up. So with this particular Mercury retrograde starting November 25th and running until December 15, Mercury does have a number of different factors making it tricky for Mercury to be clear and concise. So Mercury is not going to be as organized as usual. In turn, it might be that the part of your life that is influenced by this Mercury retrograde, and the easiest, fastest, simplest way to check that out is what is the Sagittarius part of my chart and life? Those topics, the Sagittarius part of your chart, whatever house you have Sagittarius on, that might be an area of life where you're a little bit messier. You might be slower. You might be, chasing your tail or a little bit more disorganized. You might forget a few important details, or you might be having to go back over things that you've left unfinished and try and play catch up. So Mercury in Sagittarius, as I mentioned, it is prone to a little bit of exaggeration. It is definitely a hopeful, optimistic thinking type planet. And so as this Mercury retrograde rolls out through late November and the first half of December, you might realize that some of the grand visions and ideas that you had at the start of the retrograde are not going to be as attainable or realistic as you'd thought. This particular Mercury retrograde is great for scaling things down, for figuring out how to simplify, for offloading rather than adding in, and for questioning long held commitments or obligations. And that's all thanks to the ongoing square from Mercury in Sagittarius to Saturn in Pisces. So Mercury is kind of wobbly, maybe not able to keep up with its normal pace or schedule or level of detail. And Saturn is coming in and saying, this isn't just a short-term fix. You need a more substantial long-term solution to this constant, whether it's chaos or lateness or forgetfulness, or whether it's this constant feeling of stress. We can't just get through the short-term things. We have to think about a larger, longer solution here. So hopefully that's helping you think about whatever it is you might be grappling with or struggling with a little bit in this late November, early December period. I know this time of year is so heightened with so many extra things going on for the holiday season, but it may be that your capacity to handle that is reduced because of everything that's gone on over the last 6 months. And it's all that stuff over the last 6 months that you're going to need to think about more permanent solutions or more sustainable choices so that 6 months from now or 12 months from now, you don't find yourself back in the same situation and really frantic again. I do get lots of questions from students and clients all the time about all the things that they worry they shouldn't be doing while Mercury is retrograde. Me personally, in the past, I have done all the things that we get told you shouldn't do while Mercury is retrograde. I have traveled and shopped and bought tickets and made plans all during a Mercury retrograde. In fact, I even, when I was researching personal events a while ago, I realized that I actually bought my first home under a Mercury retrograde. All those documents you sign when you're buying a property, documents at the bank, documents with the real estate agent, documents with the lawyer, doing that through a Mercury retrograde. And I share that story because it's really important to keep Mercury retrograde in perspective. A Mercury retrograde is part of the astro weather for sure, but it's unlikely to be the most important thing that you're personally experiencing. So there are so many substantial and influential timing cycles that can affect your personal chart and your life and your decisions. You want to prioritize those rather than miss out on something because Mercury's retrograde. For me personally, when I bought my first home, I was having some really major transits from Saturn and Jupiter to the 2nd and 8th houses in my chart, which makes sense. Buying a home is a huge financial commitment. There's a big loan and a debt that goes to it. Your income gets assessed, all of that piece. I bought my first home with my partner. So, 2nd, 8th house stuff makes complete sense. Those transits that I was having personally far outweighed those kind of surface or pesky themes of Mercury retrograde. At the time that the deal was finalizing, I was on a trip in a different country. And so trying to find a fax, remember those, to get documents signed and sent back definitely required extra effort and time per the Mercury retrograde. But the deal still got done. The house still got bought, and in the end, that was what mattered. And so I share this because if a major opportunity comes your way, a new job, a great place to live, a big choice that you're ready to make, it's okay to do so even if Mercury is retrograde. Maybe you have to sign an extra document or two, or you have to have further conversations to clarify terms and expectations. That's definitely Mercury retrograde at play. But don't miss what major players like Saturn and Jupiter or the outer planets might have in store for you because Mercury is moving backwards. So hopefully that's getting you rethinking how you think about Mercury retrograde. The most stuck part of any Mercury retrograde is the very start and the very end when Mercury is in station. Now, if you want to avoid doing major things like buying tickets, signing documents, these few days at the very start of Mercury retrograde and the very end when Mercury is in station, they could be fair days to avoid those typical Mercury retrograde things. You don't have to avoid them for the whole 3 and a bit weeks, but you might avoid them for, a few days at the start and the end of the retrograde. So this retrograde starts on November 25th. It ends on December 15. You might think plus or minus 2 or 3 days from November 25th and December 15th. So that's November 25th, 2 days before and 2 days after. December 15, 2 days before and 2 days after. And if you want to put a little bit of a pause on those dates, fair enough. The station is when a planet is in a holding pattern, like treading water, and the planet isn't moving at that point. And so that's where we can get that classic stuck energy. But outside of those station dates at the start and end of Mercury retrograde, Mercury can still be moving at a fairly good speed, just in reverse, kind of like when you're reversing down the street. You're probably not going 100 k's an hour in reverse, but you can perhaps go 50 or 60 k's an hour in reverse. You're still moving. There's still this sense of pace, but we are going back over things. It's not a bad thing to go back over things. We're obsessed with this sort of forward focus in our culture and in our society. We're obsessed with new and different and next. And if we use the symbolism of Mercury retrograde, that's how you can be really constructive with Mercury retrograde. I always like to take time to go back over unfinished business when Mercury is retrograde. I try to catch up on the papers and the filing, bills, etc., that just gather up about the house. I might declutter or recycle some of the magazines and newspapers that accumulate. I also try to do things like return stuff. If a friend bought a dish over and I've got their Tupperware container or what have you, I like to take that stuff back when Mercury is retrograde. So if we've borrowed something, I like to return it. Sometimes we have things that need to be repaired. I like to get that done when Mercury is retrograde. So that idea of revisiting unfinished business, sometimes I'm remembering stuff I wanted to do but just didn't get to, returning things, revisiting, repairing things. So we can be really intentional with giving ourselves a chance to catch up on stuff when Mercury is retrograde. From a work perspective, I like to go back over my inbox and my to-do list. What have I forgotten? Who do I owe a response to that I want to catch up on? So you can certainly consciously use these themes of going back or revisiting to do with Mercury retrograde, and that can help you reorganize or reconnect with matters that might still be outstanding. As you sift through unfinished matters, you might also reassess, and then you might realize, I thought I wanted to do this, but now I don't. So we can just get rid of that completely. Something that might have been interesting a few weeks or a few months back maybe isn't that exciting now that some time has passed. So hopefully you're gathering a few ideas about Mercury retrograde today, how to put it into context relative to other transits or other timing factors that you might be having, how to know when to pay attention to Mercury retrograde. If you've got a strong Mercury chart or you're in a Mercury profection or Mercury's your time lord. There's lots of Time Lord techniques. So it may be not via perfection, but some other Time Lord technique that Mercury is important to you. Mercury retrograde is a thing, but it's never the only thing, and it's often not the most important thing. Knowing your own chart and your personal trends and cycles, far more important. Weighing the retrograde of Mercury as a factor in terms of Mercury's effectiveness and function against other things that Mercury is experiencing, like the sign it's in and the aspects it's making, can be helpful as well. So it's certainly appropriate to be thoughtful or even take a little extra time over the next few weeks to be intentional or to pause while Mercury is retrograde. But please don't feel that you have to put your whole life on hold. If you've got young kids in your life, their schedules will continue. If you're running a business, your business is still operating when Mercury is retrograde. If you have the flexibility, sure, build in some extra breaks or extra space to allow for some of those unexpected, calls on hold or bloopers that might happen. If you're traveling, maybe look at options that give you more flexibility with rebooking, but do keep going about your life. I was talking to a client this week who is going to be traveling while Mercury is retrograde, and the opportunity to be out of your regular environment can be a fantastic thing while Mercury is retrograde. If you've got a story about your own Mercury retrograde experiences that you want to share, please share it with us all in the comments below. If you're enjoying the podcast, I would so appreciate a review or a like wherever you're listening. And please do subscribe, follow, or like to make sure that you get notified when new episodes drop. Thanks so much for joining me, everyone. I will see you again next week with more. Until then, take care.